In this video, I want to talk about one of the most underappreciated characters in the Stormlight Archive. Somebody who's a founding member of Bridge 4 and whose arc, I think, can tell us a huge amount about the nature of fate and destiny across the Cosmere. And that's Sigzil. This video will include spoilers for all of the Stormlight Archive up until the end of Wind and Truth. It will also include spoilers for one more book, and I feel like saying the book is in of itself a spoiler, so if you know what I'm talking about, then please keep watching, and if you don't know what I'm talking about and you really don't want to be spoiled for any other Cosmere books, then it may be a good time to click out right now. So if you haven't clicked out by now, you know this video includes spoilers for the Sunlit Man as well. Let's get into it. So over the course of both the Stormlight Archive and then eventually the Sunlit Man, we see Sigzil evolve from this kind of scholarly nerd and a detractor of Bridge 4 to being one of the most important members of Bridge 4, the commander of the Windrunners, and then this badass world-hopping fighter, essentially. But to take a step back here, I want to talk about kind of four major themes or things that happen to Sigzil that I think really have defined his arc over the course of the books. First, Sigzil is essentially a failed scholar. He came from Azir, and it seems like he came from humble beginnings. It's implied at one point that his father was a laborer, and he had dreams to join the Azish bureaucracy and become a scholar, essentially. But what we learn is that he failed to pass these kind of Azish exams, and so he failed in that goal, and that eventually led him to a very different path. That path, which is point number 2, led him to become a world singer, and in that context, he became an apprentice of Wit or Hoid. And so he has this level of Cosmere awareness, I assume, by virtue of that apprenticeship. So the World Singers, just as a reminder, are a group of people that essentially travel across kingdoms on Roshar, telling stories about other kingdoms, and their mission is to bring essentially peace through understanding in these stories. And it seems to me that they're led essentially by Hoid, or at least Hoid is a World Singer himself. And we don't really know what caused Sigzil to leave the World Singers and become a slave and then in Bridge 4. It's implied at some point that the reason for this is because he tried to kill someone, not Hoid, but it's not clear who that person was and what the his motivations were in doing so. But once he becomes a member of Bridge 4, he quickly rises to become one of Kaladin's most trusted lieutenants, and then eventually in Wind and Truth, he'll take over as a commander of the Windrunners. But in this kind of context, he is one of the only characters that we see that both joins two different Radiant orders, that's the Windrunners and then eventually the Skybreakers, and also one of the only characters that we see that essentially renounces both oaths. And so one of the key themes in the Stormlight Archives is that oaths aren't all that, they're not, following them blindly isn't necessarily the way to go, and Sigzil's journey really exemplifies that. So I want to first talk about the Windrunners, and then I'll talk about his time as a Skybreaker. And so as a Windrunner in Bridge 4, he gains these radiant powers and binds an honor spren known as Vienta. But he abandons those oaths because in a desperate bid, essentially, to save Vienta when Moash tries to kill her for good. And so he does so in the Battle of the Shattered Plains. It's kind of the last thing he can think of as a way to break that bond and send her back into the cognitive realm. There's a little bit of a similar pattern, but not quite exactly, with his second spren that he bonds, who is Ox. And if this isn't a spoiler, Ox is 12124, i.e. Set's spren, over the course of Wind and Truth. It's almost certain that that's the case. And so by the time we see Sigzil and Ox in the Sunlit Man, it appears that Sigzil has bonded Ox for some period of time and then walked away from those oaths as well. And this one is a little bit more or less clear. It's not clear why Sigzil walked away from this oath. In fact, Ox asks him that and he doesn't have a good answer. And that kind of brings me to the fourth kind of overarching characteristics, just to set it up for Sigzil, which is that he briefly carries a Dawnshard. In Wind and Truth, Wit, in an act of desperation, gives Sigzil the Dawnshard that Wit has been secretly carrying, which exists. And by the time of the Sunlit Man, Sigzil has carried it and then given it back to Wit, is what it appears to me. And I think that arc in of itself is interesting because we see once again in the theme of Sigzil giving up his Radiant Oaths, we also see him giving up his Dawnshard. And I think this idea of giving up power to me feels like is a pattern across kind of Sigzil's journey over the course of both the Stormlight Archive as well as the Sunlit Man. And there's a lot to break down here, especially around Sigzil's personality, but I think the biggest thing that I want to point to in this video is that his arc actually ends up telling us a lot about what happens after the events of Wind and Truth, along with some truths about the rest of the Cosmere. So the first really cool thing that I think we learn from Sigzil is that death rattles are not inevitable. In Wind and Truth, right before Sigzil abandons his oaths as a Windrunner, he hears Leighton, who's another member of Bridge 4, have a death rattle before he dies. And in that, Leighton essentially predicts Sigzil's death. He says, "I die, the scholar with a spear, i.e. Sigzil. I die by the hands of a friend, likely Moash. My spren screams in death, and I know that I have failed to lead. I am no captain. I am nothing. Fire strikes me, and my eyes burn." And at this point, up until this point, essentially death rattles have been painted as inevitable. But I think Sigzil's desperate act to save Vienta from Moash, from Fire, by abandoning his oaths, essentially means that he cheats this death rattle, and in some ways he kind of cheats his own destiny. So by abandoning his Windrunner oaths, he actually ends up charting kind of like this new and untold future for himself that is not tied to the death rattle. And that's like pretty crazy to me, because I think it implies that a lot of maybe what is assumed to play out may actually not. The other thing that I think is really interesting about Sigzil's journey is that it may tell us a little bit more about how to revive dead spren. And hear me out on this one, because I think that in the Sunlit Man, Vienta may still be alive, even though we saw in Wind and Truth Sigzil abandon his oaths. I think this for a couple of reasons. First, in the Sunlit Man, when Sigzil is below the ship that is carrying the Beaconites over the mountains, he is trying to make a crowbar. And at the last minute, a crowbar sharpens essentially, and he thinks he can't, he is trying to make a crowbar because he thinks he can't make a spear because of the torment on the Dawnshard that he holds that has made him unable to attack people. But at the last minute, that crowbar does sharpen to form a spear that the book describes as a symbol from Nomad or Sigzil's past, the implement of a warrior practiced in secret, then displayed in grandeur. And that can essentially only be referring to a shard spear. Now, the assumption, I think, if you look at this, is that it's Ox, but it's not. Ox explicitly says that that spear that he forms under the boat is not him. And so I think it could be a sign of Vienta returning to Sigzil. Similarly, we also get hints of his Windrunner armor returning to him. Again, in kind of the same context where he's living out the ideals of the Windrunners by trying to protect the Beaconites, and we have, and he notices that his armor for after a long time is like starting to appear in the air. So I think that what this is telling us is that even though Sigzil abandoned his Windrunner oaths, they're not necessarily dead, and they reappear when he is trying to maintain his commitment to the Windrunner ideals. Obviously, we know from Adolin that dead spren can be revived, but we still don't really know the mechanisms. And so what I think Sigzil's journey, and I think potentially Vienta's return to Sigzil shows, is that the mechanism is that if you live out the ideals in a manner that is separate from your oaths, then maybe you can revive dead spren. The last thing that I think Sigzil's journey tells us about the Cosmere, or especially about the Rasharan system, is that there may still be people on Ashen. So as a reminder, Ashen is the planet where humans came from after essentially they destroyed it, and they came and they fled to Rashar as refugees essentially. And up until this point, I had presumed that everyone on Ashen that didn't escape to Rashar died. But Sigzil has an interesting point in The Sunlit Man, where there's kind of a throwaway note where he says he's been on flying cities before, including one on a planet near his homeworld. And I think that's just kind of a veiled reference to Ashen, because we know that Ashen essentially burned and the ground was essentially aflame. And so those residents, kind of like the ones on Canicle in The Sunlit Man, may have created flying cities that Sigzil visits at some point after the events of Wind and Truth and before the events of Sunlit Man start. And so it's very cool to think about the original humans in the Rasharan system and how their culture may have evolved after this devastating war that Honor and Odium essentially wrecked on Ashen. So Sigzil is such a cool character, and I think his journey over the course of Wind and Truth and the Sunlit Man really helps unravel a lot of the mysteries of the Cosmere. But I'd be interested in what you all think about his character. So if you like this video, please hit like and please subscribe. And I'd love to hear any comments or reactions you have to any of this. Thanks, everyone.